What if I told you that David never truly died? Think back to the Lost Boys. That haunting final battle in the cave lair. Michael drives David into a mounted set of antlers. The camera lingers on his face, frozen in shock. Silence fills the cavern. For the audience, this moment is supposed to mark the end of the story. The villain has fallen. Order has been restored. But did you notice what didn't happen? No fire, no ash, no violent collapse of bone and dust. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden secrets behind legendary horror films. Every other vampire in the Lost Boys combusts spectacularly when killed burning, bursting, or crumbling into ruin. But not David. His body remains whole, pristine, even beautiful in its stillness. This isn't just a small oversight in special effects. It's a clue, a breadcrumb the filmmakers left behind. Because what the movie never says, but what the lore implies, is simple. The antlers never pierced his heart. They punctured his lung. Painful, yes. Disabling, yes. But fatal. Not for a vampire tethered to something older and far darker than simple folklore. And when Mac's true head vampire was destroyed, the chain of command broke. The others crumbled, tied to him through blood. But David remained. Not dead, not dust, not gone. For the first time since his transformation, he was free. Freed from the sire who made him. Freed from the bloodline that bound him. He became something else entirely. A rogue immortal, unshackled. An echo of the curse that had haunted Santa Carla for generations. Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of his story. We'll travel back to the year 1906, when a hotel collapse reshaped a city. We'll explore how a boy named David was caught in its ruins, only to be pulled into the darkness by the very creatures responsible. And we'll follow the thread of his existence through the decayed drifters, gangsters, bikers, punks until the day he forged his family, the Lost Boys. But most haunting of all, we'll look at how his bloodline gave rise to Shane Powers, the merciless leader of the tribe, and how every outbreak in Santa Carla can be traced back to David's curse. By the end of this story, you'll never look at the Lost Boys the same way again. The power of origins. Stories endure because they leave gaps. They make us ask, what really happened? David's so-called death is one of those gaps. And in those cracks of uncertainty, legends are born. Think of Sherlock Holmes. In Arthur Conan Doyle's story, The Final Problem, Holmes fell to his death at Reichenbach Falls. Readers mourned. The saga was over. But demand for Holmes's return was so overwhelming that Doyle eventually revived him, claiming he had faked his death. A death that wasn't really a death at all. David is Holmes's shadow in the world of vampires. A character too charismatic, too iconic, too unforgettable to end so abruptly. His supposed death feels more like a doorway than a conclusion. And if we follow that doorway backwards into the history of Santa Carla, or discover something far bigger than a single vampire, we uncover a city born in blood. The Ghost King of Santa Carla. David isn't just another vampire villain. He's Santa Carla, itself embodiment of its sins, its losses, its buried past. The 1906 Hudson's hotel collapse wasn't a random accident. It was a ritual sacrifice, engineered by a coven of vampires who had already claimed the town as their hunting ground. The hotel, once a symbol of luxury and progress, became a tomb. And within that tomb, the curse of Santa Carla was sealed. David's rebirth in that moment was not coincidence. He was tethered to the ruins, to the blood-soaked soil. Unlike other vampires who fade when their makers perish, David was anchored by something older than blood, a curse rooted in the land itself. That's why his body never turned to dust. That's why his story never ended. Why this story matters now. At first glance, you might wonder we dig this deep into the lore of a cult classic horror movie. Why explore the hidden origins of a fictional vampire? Because stories, even fictional ones, reveal truths about us. David's survival isn't about more than vampires. It's about trauma, legacy, and the shadows of our origins. He's a metaphor for the ruins that shape us, disasters that scar a city, a family, or a person. His story asks, when we lose everything, what do we become? Do we remain tethered to that pain forever? Or do we transform into something new? And in that sense, David is both warning and wonder, a reminder that the past never really dies. It sleeps, waiting, beneath the surface. The journey ahead. Over the course of this story, we'll explore the curse of Santa Carla, how the Hudson's hotel collapse created a ley line of death that still pulses beneath the city. David's transformation, how a grieving boy was remade into something eternal. His evolution through the decades, how he learned, adapted, and became the charismatic predator we know. The Lost Boys formation, why he chose his gang, and why their lair wasn't just a hideout but sacred ground. The making of Shane Powers, how David's bloodline birthed the alpha of the tribe. The eternal shadow, why David's influence still lingers, and how his story is far from over. Every one of these threads connects back to that first moment in the cave when David did not burn, did not crumble, and did not vanish. The movie ended, but the legend only began. So let us step back in time to 1906, to the night the Hudson's hotel fell into the earth, taking hundreds of lives with it, to the night Santa Carla was cursed forever, and to the night David's story truly began. A city before the shadows, before Santa Carla became infamous for missing persons posters, vampire attacks, and its neon-lit boardwalk. It was just another coastal jewel of California's Gilded Age. The early 1900s brought a wave of optimism. Railroads carried tourists westward, businessmen invested in seaside resorts, and families dreamed of a life along the Pacific. At the heart of this dream stood the Hudson's Hotel, a grand building of marble pillars and polished oak. It wasn't just a hotel, it was the pride of Santa Carla. Imagine it glowing at night with gaslight chandeliers, the lobby buzzing with music and laughter, the Pacific wind drifting through balconies where women in lace gowns and men in press suits toasted to the future. But the brighter the light, the darker the shadows it casts. And in Santa Carla, shadows fed on more than rumor. The hidden coven. What most townsfolk never knew was that Santa Carla was already claimed. For decades, a coven of vampires had quietly made the city their hunting ground. They preyed on travelers, sailors, drifters, those who could disappear without questions. They moved like ghosts among the living. A missing sailor here, a vanished guest there, deaths chalked up to accidents, drownings, or drunken brawls. But behind those vanishings lay a meticulous design. Keep the population intact, but feed from the fringes. Never take too much. Never draw attention. Until 1906, because in 1906, the coven decided to rewrite the rules. The collapse. The Hudson's Hotel was full the night it fell. Families, businessmen, and staff slept soundly when the earth shuddered. Some claimed it was an earthquake. Others whispered of poor construction. But survivors, few though they were, spoke of something stranger. They said they heard laughter. They said they saw flames before the walls crumbled. Eyewitnesses described the collapse as violent, not gradual. Like the earth itself had swallowed the building whole. Hundreds of lives vanished into the rubble. The screams that rose from beneath the wreckage were said to echo for hours, carried on the ocean wind. But here's the truth whispered in vampire lore. It wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. The coven orchestrated the collapse as a mass sacrifice. The dead were not merely victims of stone and steel, they were fuel. Fuel for something far worse. Blood in the soil. When the hotel came crashing down, the ground beneath Santa Carla became something unnatural. The soil drank in the blood of the hundreds trapped inside. The cries of the dying mingled with rituals spoken in shadowed corners. What should have been ruins became a ley-line crypt, a nexus of grief and death that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the city. In folklore, certain places absorb the tragedies that occur upon them. The Tower of London, Gettysburg, Chernobylications forever scarred by human suffering. Santa Carla's ruins join their ranks. Except here, the tragedy wasn't only human, it was engineered by monsters. The coven buried their crime beneath the earth, and with it, the secret foundation of Santa Carla's curse. The survivors, a few survived, pulled half alive from the rubble. They spoke of shadows moving where no light fell, of whispers in languages they couldn't understand. Some went mad. Others left town and never returned. The newspapers framed it as a disaster story, blaming faulty construction and unstable ground. But buried within the records of the time are inconsistencies, names of guests who had no surviving family, staff who were never accounted for, and police reports sealed without explanation. For those who look deeper, it becomes clear the collapse wasn't just about the dead, it was about what the living carried away from it. One of those survivors was a boy named David. David and the curse. David wasn't supposed to survive. By all accounts, he should have died with his family, buried in the rubble like the others. But fate or something dark urged differently. When rescuers never came, when the rubble threatened to suffocate him, David felt hands pulling him free. Not warm, human hands, but cold ones. He was not saved. He was claimed. And from that moment forward, he was tethered to Carla's curse. Unlike the others, David wasn't just another victim. He became a vessel. The blood-soaked soil of the Hudson's ruins seeped into him, anchoring him to the city. He wasn't merely turned into a vampire, he was fused with the very energy of Carla's darkest night. That's why, decades later, he returned to those ruins, not by choice, but by instinct. To him, the crumbling hotel wasn't just shelter, it was home. The lingering whispers, even today. If you walk along the cliffs where the Hudson's Hotel once stood, locals will tell you stories. They'll whisper about hearing screams at night carried on the wind. Some claim to see lights glowing beneath the earth, faint red like coals refusing to die. Urban legends call it a haunted ground. But in the lore of the Lost Boys, it's far more than that. It's the cradle of a vampire king. Real-world parallels. This idea that tragedy stains a place forever isn't just horror fiction. It's something deeply human. Consider Pompeii, where the eruption of Vesuvius preserved human figures mid-scream, frozen in ash, or Hiroshima, where shadows of people remained imprinted on walls after the atomic blast. In places of immense death, memory doesn't fade, it becomes part of the environment. Carla mirrors this. The Hudson's Hotel collapse wasn't remembered only in newspapers. It was remembered in whispers, in ruins, in the soil itself. And just as Pompeii produced ghosts of ash, Carla produced something darker. David. From tragedy to legend, every city has an origin story. Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus. New Orleans is tied to voodoo queens and pirate legends. Carla's origin is the Hudson's Collapsia story of blood, fire, and whispers beneath the earth. And within that story lies the seed of David's immortality. He wasn't just another vampire. He was the living embodiment of the city's original sin. That's why he could not die the way others did. That's why his body remained whole. Because he wasn't only tied to a siren, was tied to a curse. To understand David fully, we can't stop at the collapse. We must go deeper into the boy who lived it, who lost everything in a single night, who emerged from the rubble not as a son or a brother, but as something entirely different. The next chapter of his story begins not with power, but with loss, not with leadership, but with grief. Before the darkness, before the antlers, before the motorcycle engines, before the sunglasses and smirk, David was simply a boy, born in the early 1900s. He was the son of a family swept up in the restless tide of the American frontier. His father was a rail worker, hardened by steel tracks and long nights away from home. His mother carried with her a softer presence European roots, heavy with folklore, superstition, and tales of blood drinkers and night spirits whispered in candlelit kitchens. For young David, these stories were bedtime lullabies. Where others heard fear, he heard fascination. The idea that the world held hidden power spirits that walked at night, curses that lingered in shadows gave him a strange sense of belonging. He wasn't afraid. He was curious. But curiosity turns to dread when myth becomes real. The night of the collapse, when the Hudson's Hotel crumbled, David was still a teenager. His family had traveled west with the promise of prosperity. That night, they were guests inside the shining jewel of Carla. The collapse was chaos. Imagine being trapped beneath splintered beams and choking dust. hearing your mother's voice silenced in an instant, your father's grip slipping from your hand in the dark. Imagine the weight of stone pressing down, the air thick with screams, then silence. For hours longer David lay pinned in darkness, his chest crushed, his body trembling. He screamed until his throat was raw. But no rescuers came. The air grew colder. The whispers came, not from survivors, but from something older. Shadows moved where no light fell. And then, as his strength faded, he felt hands pulling him free. The Coven's choice. The figures who lifted him from the rubble weren't human. They smelled of earth and ash, their eyes gleaming like coals. They studied him like scavengers study wounded prey. Normally, the Coven killed survivors to erase witnesses. But something about David gave them pause. Perhaps it was his will to live, even as his lungs collapsed. Perhaps it was the anger in his eyes, burning through grief. Or perhaps it was something deep earth curse of the ruins already seeping into him, marking him as theirs. Whatever the reason, they offered him a choice, not with kind words, but with blood. A cut wrist, a drop against his lips, the taste of eternity, the moment of transformation. Imagine being a boy who has lost everything. Your family is gone, your future buried in rubble, your heart hollowed by grief, and then you are given a choice: die as a boy or live as something else. David chose survival. When he drank, the warmth spread like fire. His broken ribs no longer ached. His breath came back, ragged but real. His body filled with strength he never imagined. But with it came hunger, annoying, endless hunger that whispered in his veins. And in that moment, David died. Not in body, but in soul. The boy was gone. The survivor was born. The tether of the curse. What David didn't realize was that he wasn't simply turned into a vampire. His rebirth was fused with the curse of the Hudson's hotel. The soil beneath the ruins was soaked with the blood of hundreds. Their screams lingered in the stone. And because David had been trapped there, because he had lost everything there, that curse latched onto him. While other vampires were bound to their sires, David was bound to Santa Carla itself. The ruins became his cradle and his anchor. No matter how far he roamed in the decades to come, the city would always pull him back. Life after loss. The Coven treated David not as family, but as a soldier. He was another recruit in their endless war against humanity. But David was never content to be a follower. He watched, listened, and learned. Where others fed like animals, David studied people. He learned how to speak, how to charm, how to manipulate. He learned that loyalty was a stronger leash than fear, and he learned to wear masks soft when he needed to be, ruthless when he wanted to be. The boy who lost his family became a man who could build his own. The psychology of survival. In many ways, David's transformation mirrors the stories of real survivors of tragedy. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt-haunting question of why you lived when others didn't. Think of those who escaped the Titanic, or those who walked out of collapsed mines, or even the soldiers who returned from World War I. Many reported the same sensation. They no longer felt like themselves. They had died with those they lost, and what walked away was someone new, someone colder, someone harder. David embodied this. He lost his family in the rubble. The person who crawled out was not the same. His rebirth was as much psychological as supernatural. Why he chose the darkness? Could David have refused? Could he have spat out the blood and chosen death? Perhaps, but history shows us that in the moment of survival, instinct overrules morality. When faced with death, even the strongest convictions bend. Take the infamous Donner Party of 1846. Stranded in the Sierra Nevada, they turned to cannibalism to survive, not because they were monsters, but because the body clings to life with everything it has. David's choice was no different. His body wanted to live. His soul wanted revenge. Together, those wants made him eternal, the last glimpse of humanity. But make no mistake, some part of David never let go of his human pain. The smile, the charisma, the need for belonging, all of it came from that broken boy in the ruins. He didn't just want power. He wanted family, a replacement for what he lost. It's why he gathered the Lost Boys decades later. It's why he pulled Shane Powers into his bloodline. He wasn't just building an army, he was rebuilding the family taken from him in 1906. So when you see David smirking from behind his sunglasses, when you hear him whisper promises of belonging to Michael, remember this: beneath the predator was once a boy, trapped in rubble, crying out for his mother. He never escaped that night, he only transformed it. And as the decades rolled on, that transformation deepened. David didn't just survive, adapted. He evolved with every passing generation, weaving himself into the very fabric of America's rebellious spirit, which brings us to the next chapter of his story. How David the boy became David the predator. The hunger and the road. After his transformation in 1906, David's first decades of immortality were restless ones. He had no family, no roots, only hunger. He drifted along the railroads of California, feeding in the shadows of stations where no one asked questions about missing drifters. The hunger taught him cruelty, but the loneliness taught him patience. Unlike the coven who made him, David didn't want to hide forever in shadows. He wanted to walk among people, to feel their pulse not only beneath his teeth, but in their laughter, their music, their rebellion. This is where his evolution began. The 1910s learning to blend. In the years following his turning, David wandered the rail lines and coastal towns of California. The 1910s were a period of transition, for American industrialization was booming. Immigrants poured into the country, and the Great War loomed overseas. David, still young, learned to camouflage. He dressed like the workers, traveled with migrants, and learned their tongues. He absorbed the mannerisms of every group he fed from. While the coven fed like predators, quick, brutal, and silent, David practiced something different. He learned to talk to his prey, to win trust before he struck. He became a conman of blood, a smiling drifter who could share a campfire story before draining his companion dry. This adaptation mirrors how predators in nature evolve strategies. Wolves hunt in packs, snakes ambush, but the most dangerous are those who deceive, anglerfish luring prey with light. David became the angler of the vampire world. The 1920s gangsters and bootleggers. The Roaring Twenties were a perfect breeding ground for David's growth. Prohibition-fueled underground speakeasies, organized crime rose, and cities became playgrounds of decadence. David thrived here. He slipped into speakeasies, dressed in sharp suits, his blonde hair slicked back to blend with the mobsters and jazz crowds. Where others saw prohibition as limitation, David saw opportunity. Alcohol wasn't the only thing traded in secret. Human life was cheap. Gangsters buried rivals in shallow graves. Police looked the other way, and missing persons rarely made headlines. David fed freely, but more importantly, he learned power. He studied how mob bosses commanded loyalty, not just through fear, but through family. The mafia taught him the art of belonging, brotherhood wrapped around violence. It was a lesson he never forgot. The 1930s depression and desperation. The Great Depression reshaped America, and David walked its broken highways like a phantom. Migrant camps, bread lines, and rail cars full of desperate men gave him endless prey. But here, something changed. David began experimenting with charisma. He would arrive at a camp, offer food or charm with a story, and then vanish with a victim in the night. He was no longer just a predator, was becoming a leader. Even if only for a night, he could inspire trust, even loyalty. In history, desperate times often create openings for charismatic figures. Franklin Roosevelt offered hope in fireside chats. Cult leaders like Father Divine or William Dudley Pelley offered salvation to the hungry and disillusioned. David's presence in these camps mirrored that same phenomenon born from hunger and desperation. The 1940s war and motorcycles. World War II reshaped the world, and even immortals felt its tremors. Many vampires stayed hidden, fearful of the violence, but David embraced it. He haunted port cities like San Diego, feeding on young sailors before they shipped out to war. He drifted through blackout cities, where dim lights and rationed goods created perfect cover for predators. But it was after the war that David discovered something that would define him forever: motorcycles. Returning soldiers formed outlaw motorcycle clubs, restless young men with no taste for normal life. They were misfits, rebels, violent, and free. David saw himself in them. Leather jackets, roaring engines. The thrill of the open road. This became his armor. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight anymore. He was building a persona. The boy from 1906 had grown into the vampire king of asphalt and night. The 1950s, the age of rebellion. While America worshipped conformity in the 1950s, a countercurrent brewed. James Dean, Marlon Brando, rock and roll icons of rebellion. David slid effortlessly into this culture. With his eternal youth and sharp features, he looked like the very embodiment of teenage defiance. He prowled diners and drive-ins, blending with greasers and rebels without a cause. Where adults saw delinquency, David saw camouflage. He wasn't a monster in the shadows anymore. He was a face in the crowd, indistinguishable from the restless youth around him. This was David's genius. Unlike Nosferatu or Dracula, he wasn't a creature apart. He was us. He was the rebel, the outsider, the misunderstood leader. And that's why audiences in the 1980s found him irresistible. He was dangerous, yes, but he was familiar. He looked like the boys you might have had a crush on in high school. The 1960s counterculture and the edge of darkness. The 1960s exploded with change hippies, protests, drugs, and music that promised revolution. David played both sides. He lingered on the edges of counterculture gatherings, feeding on drifters who vanished into the haze of Woodstock-style festivals. But he also thrived in the chaos of biker gangs, whose violence gave him cover. David adapted again. He absorbed the stylish long hair, the leather, the untamed look of a man who lived free. Yet beneath the freedom, he saw something deeper, the fragility of movements built on dreams. Where hippies believed in love, David knew hunger would always win. Where protesters dreamed of peace, he knew chaos always lurked. He studied humanity's illusions and grew more cunning. The 1970s punk and the birth of a predator. If the 1960s were about dreams, the 1970s were about disillusionment. Vietnam, Watergate, a generation burned out. And from that ash came punk. David was made for punk. The snarling leather, the ripped jeans, the music that screamed defiant sight was his aesthetic incarnate. He haunted nightclubs, stood at the front of concerts, his platinum hair catching the strobe lights as he smiled his predatory grin. To punks, he wasn't an outsider. He was their leader. Unlike the coven that raised him, David didn't isolate. He immersed himself in subculture, feeding not just on blood, but on belonging. By the end of the 1970s, David was no longer a drifter. He was something bigger, a predator who knew how to blend, how to inspire, and how to command. From boy to king. By the time the 1980s dawned, David was ready. He had mastered the art of identity. He had lived through railroads, bootleggers, greasers, bikers, hippies, and punks. Each decade had given him tools, and he had forged them into a crown. When he returned to Santa Carla and gathered his lost boys, it wasn't chance. It was destiny. The boy from the ruins had become the king of misfits. But David's evolution didn't stop with himself. His need for family, ghost of the family he lost in 1906, pushed him to create something lasting. He built the Lost Boys not just as a gang, but as his kingdom. And in the ruins of the Hudson's hotel, his cradle and his curse, that kingdom was born. The pull back to Santa Carla. For decades David drifted across America, feeding, learning, and adapting. Yet no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many cities, clubs, or highways he haunted, always found himself pulled back to Santa Carla. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't memory. It was tether. The ruins of the Hudson's hotel were his cradle, his anchor, his curse. The soil that had drunk his family's blood had claimed him. And when he returned in the early 1980s, it wasn't by chance. It was inevitability. The ruins still whispered. The shadows still pulsed. And David, now fully grown into his dark charisma, understood something he had not as a boy. This place was not simply a lair. It was a throne waiting for him to claim. Meeting the Lost Boys. It was here that David began to gather those who would become his brothers in immortality: Marco, Paul, and Dwayne. None of them were chosen at random. David didn't just bite out of hunger. He selected. He searched for traits that mirrored parts of himself: broken, the rebellious, the outcast. Marco was the jester, the wild spark of humor in the darkness. He masked his pain with laughter, something David understood all too well. Paul embodied recklessness, living for thrills with no thought of consequence. In him, David saw the raw hunger of survival untamed. Dwayne was quiet, loyal, and thoughtful, balance David needed, the reflection of the boy he once was. Together, they weren't just a gang. They were fragments of David's own shattered soul, stitched together into something resembling a family. The lair is sacred ground. Their lair beneath the cliffs wasn't just an abandoned ruin. It was the heart of David's power. The chandeliers that hung crooked in the cavern, the murals half collapsed, the echoes of laughter long gone, it all spoke to the night the hotel had fallen. For Marco, Paul, and Dwayne, it was a playground. For David, it was a cathedral. Every night they returned there, David felt it. The whispers in the stone, the pull of blood in the soil. It was as if the city itself acknowledged him as its rightful king. This was no coincidence. The lair wasn't chosen for a convenience. It was destiny. The allure of David's leadership. What made David more dangerous than any other vampire wasn't his strength or his hunger, it was his ability to lead. People followed him. They couldn't help it. His smirk, his confidence, his aura of belonging. David radiated what everyone craved: acceptance. Michael felt it the moment he met him. Star felt it when she stood at his side. Even the audience feels it watching him on screen. David didn't just bite. He seduced. He made you feel like you mattered. And then he used that belonging as a leash. This reflects how cult leaders work. Jim Jones, Charles Manson, David Koresh promised love, family, and acceptance to outcasts. Once trust was given, they twisted it into control. David's Lost Boys were no different. They weren't just vampires, they were disciples. Family through blood. To understand David's obsession with creating the Lost Boys, you have to remember the boy in the rubble. The boy who lost his parents and was given nothing but darkness. Every new vampire he turned wasn't just a recruit. They were an attempt to rebuild the family ripped from him. He played the role of brother, father, king, whatever was needed. And the Lost Boys responded with loyalty, because David gave them something rare, a sense of home in the chaos of youth. But there was a price. David's family was built not on trust, but on blood. And blood has a way of betraying itself. The seduction of Michael. When Michael entered the picture, David saw more than prey. He saw a mirror. Michael was young, restless, and searching for a belonging. He was the perfect candidate for David's family. The infamous bottle of blood wasn't just about turning him, it was about binding him. David whispered promises of belonging, of freedom, of eternal youth. And Michael listened, as so many before him had. But Michael resisted, and that resistance wounded David deeper than any stake could. Because for David, it wasn't just about making another vampire. It was about never again being abandoned. And Michael's rejection, and the wound of 1906, the night his family was buried, and he was left alone. The symbolism of the Lost Boys. On the surface, the Lost Boys are a gang of stylish vampires in leather jackets. But look closer, and there's something more profound, a metaphor for eternal adolescence. They never grow old. They never take responsibility. They never face the consequences of their actions. They are trapped in an endless loop of rebellion. And David is their leader, their eternal Peter Pan. But unlike Peter, his Neverland isn't magic, it's cursed earth, soaked in blood. Reflection. This is why the film resonates even today. Every generation has its Lost Boys caught between rebellion and belonging, between freedom and destruction. David embodies both the thrill and the tragedy of never growing up. The Throne of Shadows. By the mid-1980s, David was firmly entrenched as the king of Santa Carla. The Lost Boys ruled the night, hunting in frenzied packs, their laughter echoing through boardwalks and beaches. To outsiders, They were just another group of punks on motorcycles. To locals, they were nightmares given form. To David, they were his crown. But beneath the swagger, beneath the smirks and leather, the truth remained. He was still that boy from 1906, clinging to the ruins, trying to rebuild what he had lost. And that longing would one day shape his most dangerous decision, the turning of Shane Powers. The Lost Boys weren't the end of David's story. They were the beginning of his legacy, because when he chose to turn Shane, he wasn't just creating another vampire. He was creating the heir to his curse. And that heir would twist David's dream of family into a nightmare of violence. The bonfire. The fire roared on the beach, its flames twisting high into the coastal night. Surfers gathered, shouting and laughing, passing bottles, the ocean crashing just beyond their circle of light. To them, it was freedom. To David and his Lost Boys, it was a feast. They descended with chaos. Shadows flickered through the flames. Screams tore into the surf. Blood sprayed against firelit sand. The surfers fought, but the vampires tore through them like paper. It was a massacre, but one among them, Shane Powers, was different. Shane's nature. Shane was already a leader before that night. Known as the head of the Nazi surfers, he thrived on intimidation, control, and violence. His gang ruled the waves with cruelty, dominating not for fun, but for fear. Where most victims screamed, Shane fought. His eyes weren't filled with terror, but with rage. Even as his friends fell around him, he snarled, refusing to yield. And David saw something in him. The same fire, the same hunger, the same will to survive. David's choice. David had a decision. He could kill Shane, as he did the others, leaving his body broken on the sand. Or he could do something more dangerous. He could offer him eternity. For reasons only David knew, he chose the second path. Perhaps he saw in Shane a reflection of himself, boy in the rubble, unwilling to die, fueled by anger. Or perhaps he wanted to create not just family, but a true heir. David let him taste the blood, and with that, Shane Powers became the first true child of David's bloodline. The difference between them. But there was a flaw in David's choice. Where David craved family, Shane craved power. David's leadership was built on seduction, on belonging, on creating a tribe of misfits who would follow him to the ends of the earth. Shane's leadership was built on domination. He didn't want brothers wanted subjects. This difference would shape everything that came after. The rise of Shane Powers. When David vanished after his supposed death at Michael's hands, the Lost Boys scattered. But Shane didn't just survive. He rose. He twisted David's dream of family into a nightmare of violence. Where David's boys had laughed and played, Shane's tribe brutalized and destroyed. Where David's charisma inspired loyalty, Shane's fear demanded obedience. This is the legacy of bad mentorship. When you pass on your gifts to someone who twists them into something darker than you ever imagined. History is full of such examples. Alexander the Great exceeded his teacher Aristotle, but turned philosophy into conquest. Steve Jobs rebelled against his mentors and created an empire his teachers never dreamed of. And in darker parallels, cult leaders often raise disciples who become more extreme than their masters. Jim Jones's lieutenants, who continued violence even after his death. Shane was David's lieutenant, but without David's vision, he became something monstrous. The bloodline. Shane represented something new in Santa Carla, a vampire not tied to Max's line, but to David's. This made him unique. He didn't carry the same weaknesses, the same rules. He was freer, wilder, and anchored from the traditional hierarchy of vampire lore. He was the first scion of a curse born immortal, and that made him terrifying, because if David could not die, then neither could his bloodline. The tribe. By the time of the Lost Boys, the tribe, Shane had built his own following. No longer a boy clinging to his gang. He was a tyrant. His vampires were not playful or loyal, they were violent, vicious, hungry. He took David's vision of belonging and corrupted it into domination. The tribe was not a family, it was a cult of fear. And yet, at the root of it, David's fingerprints remained. The smirk, the charisma, the lure of rebellion. Shane inherited these traits. But where David offered love, Shane offered control. The curse passed down. Here lies the true horror of David's choice. He didn't just create a vampire. He created a legacy. Every vampire outbreak in Santa Carla after David traces back to him not just because of his survival, but because of Shane. The tribe wasn't random. It was living proof of David's bloodline. This is why Santa Carla never escapes its curse, because David's shadow spreads not only through his own existence, but through those he marked. Mentorship gone wrong. In many ways, Shane Powers is the cautionary tale of David's story. David, haunted by the loss of his family, tried to recreate what he had lost, but by turning Shane, he failed his own test. He mistook ambition for loyalty. He gave eternity to a man who wanted only power, and in that mistake, David ensured that even if he slept, his curse would live on. So when we look at Shane's tribe, we aren't seeing something new. We're seeing David's reflection distorted, darker, stripped of charm and love. We're seeing what happens when legacy is twisted by those unworthy of it. And that brings us to the heart of Santa Carla's curse. It was never just about a town haunted by vampires. It was about one boy in 1906 whose choices echoed across a century. And those echoes were far from finished. The illusion of an ending. When Michael drove David onto the antlers in The Lost Boys, audiences believed it was the end. Good triumphed, evil fell, and Santa Carla was freed. The Frog brothers cheered, the Emerson family reunited, and Max's death seemed to break the chain of darkness. But evil rarely ends so neatly. David's body never turned to dust. His flesh never burned. Instead, he remained whole, suspended, preserved. The illusion of victory blinded them to the truth. David had not perished. He had been unbound. The nature of the curse. Unlike his Lost Boys, David's existence wasn't tied to Max. He had been born of the Hudson's hotel collapse, fused to the blood-soaked soil. That tether meant he couldn't simply vanish when his sire did. The curse was his anchor. His blood was its vessel. So when Max died, David wasn't destroyed. He was freed. Think of it like a king whose leash has been cut. No longer restrained by hierarchy, David became something more dangerous, a rogue immortal with no master, no boundaries, and no rules. Echoes in Santa Carla. This is why Santa Carla never escaped its curse. Every new outbreak of vampires, every new tribe, every whisper of blood in the streets, it all traced back to David. The Frog brothers thought they were fighting new enemies each decade, but they were really fighting shadows of the same source. The city wasn't cursed by chance. It was cursed by David. Santa Carla wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a haunted graveyard where one boy's transformation rippled endlessly through time. The Ghost King. Legends call him the Ghost King of Santa Carla. Not dust, not dead, not alive, but something in between. Some say his body still lies in the ruins of the Hudson's hotel, entombed in the earth, untouched by decay. Others claim his soul roams the boardwalk at night, unseen, but felt in every flickering neon light and every missing poster stapled to a lamppost. In whispers, locals say he is fed by every drop of blood spilled in the city, that every scream echoes into his slumber, that one day, when the hunger is great enough, he will awaken, and when he does, he will not return as the David we remember. He will be something older, something shaped not only by blood, but by the curse itself, the archetype of the eternal villain. David's lingering presence taps into a very old archetype, the villain who never truly dies. In myth, we see this in figures like Kronos, bound beneath the earth, but never gone, waiting to rise again. In literature, it's Dracula, whose ashes always seem to reform in another corner of the world. In history, it's the way tyrants live on even after death, their ideologies echoed in the generations they scarred. David embodies all of these. He isn't just a vampire. He's the curse of Santa Carla, given form. The Frog brothers' mistake. The Frog brothers dedicated their lives to fighting vampires in Santa Carla, believing each new outbreak was a fresh threat. But the truth is more chilling. They were never fighting something new. They were fighting the same enemy over and over. David's influence infected the city like a virus. His blood created Shane. Shane created his tribe, and on it went, like ripples in water. The Frog brothers were swatting at shadows. The source remained untouched beneath the ruins. Santa Carla as a character. In truth, David and Santa Carla cannot be separated. The city is more than a backdrop, it is a character, alive with the echoes of 1906. Every neon sign, every roller coaster scream, every missing poster is part of its identity. And at the heart of it all lies David. Santa Carla is David's body. Its pulse is his. Its hunger is his. Its curse is his. Modern urban legends. Even outside the Lost Boys films, you can imagine how locals might talk about him. Fishermen claim to see a pale figure watching from the cliffs at dawn. Teenagers whisper that if you say David's name 3 times on the boardwalk at midnight, you'll hear motorcycles in the distance. Parents tell their children to be home before dark, warning them not of gangs, but of the king who never died. Urban legends always grow from fear, and David is the seed from which Santa Carla's myths bloom. Why he endures? David endures because he represents something timeless, the trauma that never fades. He is the ghost of 1906, when a boy lost his family and was remade in blood. He is the shadow of every decade of rebellion, every misfit who never found home. He is the reflection of every survivor who wonders, why me? Why am I still here when others are gone? That question is eternal, and so is David, awaiting the awakening. The final question remains, where is he now? If the legends are true, his body still lies in the ruins of the Hudson's Hotel, untouched, waiting, not dust, not dead, preserved by the curse. One day, the blood spilled in Santa Carla may be enough to stir him, and when he awakens, he won't be the same David who smirked in sunglasses on the boardwalk. He will be something older, something more, not a vampire, not a man, but an elder, a god of the coast. David's story reminds us that evil doesn't always end with a stake through the heart. Sometimes it lingers, sometimes it waits, and in Santa Carla, the waiting never ends. But what does that mean for us? For those who watch these stories, who feel the pull of their metaphors, that is where David's true lesson lies, and that is where we'll turn next. The boy who never escaped. When we peel back the layers of David's story past the leather, the sunglasses, the motorcycles, will find something hauntingly simple. A boy who never escaped the night his world collapsed. The Hudson's Hotel buried his family, and in their place, he was given immortality. But immortality wasn't freedom, it was a chain. Every decade he lived, every gang he formed, every person he turned it was all an echo of the same wound. David's curse wasn't just being a vampire, it was being unable to let go, the metaphor of trauma. In this way, David isn't just a villain, he's a metaphor for trauma. Trauma doesn't vanish when the moment passes, it lingers, anchors itself, and resurfaces in the choices we make. Just like David always returned to Santa Carla, people return consciously or not the sights of their own pain. Some drink to forget, some hurt others to mask their wounds. Some, like David, build families out of fear of abandonment, trying to fill a hole that cannot be filled. David is the embodiment of what happens when we never confront the past. We don't bury it, it buries us. The shadow of legacy. David also shows us the danger of legacy left unchecked. By turning Shane powers, he didn't just create a vampire, he created a legacy of violence that twisted his dream of family into a nightmare. Shane didn't inherit David's longing for belonging, he inherited his hunger for power. This is how trauma spreads across generations. Hurt people. Survivors who never heal pass their shadows onto those who follow. What starts as pain becomes inheritance. And in Santa Carla, that inheritance was written in blood. The seduction of belonging, perhaps the most dangerous part of David's story, is also the most seductive. His ability to make people feel like they belonged. Michael didn't follow David because of fear. He followed him because David made him feel seen. Every smirk, every promise of freedom, every whispered invitation carried the same message. You're not alone anymore. That is the power of charismatic leaders. They offer belonging to the lost, They build families out of outcasts, and then, when the leash is tied, they twist that belonging into control. David wasn't just a vampire, he was a cult leader. And like every cult leader, his greatest weapon wasn't his strength, it was his ability to make you want to stay. Real-world reflections. History is filled with Davids, tyrants who rose from childhood wounds, turning their pain into power that scarred nations, cult leaders who offered love and belonging to the lonely, only to manipulate them into violence, generational trauma passed through families, where the abuse of one generation echoes into the next. David's story, though fictional, reflects these truths. He is the ghost of every survivor who never healed, every leader who twisted pain into power, every legacy of violence that refuses to die. The lesson of David's curse. So what do we take from this? David teaches us that survival alone is not enough. It is possible to live forever and never truly live. If we never face the ruins of our past, we become them. His curse warns us, if we don't confront our pain, it will anchor us. If we don't heal, we'll pass that pain to others. And if we cling to belonging without trust, we'll be led by shadows instead of light. David never escaped the boy in the rubble, and because of that, he became the king of shadows. A call to the audience. As you finish this story, ask yourself, what ruins still haunt you? What memories pull you back, over and over? No matter how far you travel, are you tethered to pain, or are you building something new? Because unlike David, we are not immortal. Our time is short, and the choice we have is this: do we live anchored to our curses, or do we finally set them free? The Eternal King. David's legend will endure, on screen, in sequels, in whispers of fans who wonder if he truly died. But his true entrance isn't in film. It's in the way his story reflects our own struggles. We all carry shadows. We all face collapse. The question is, will we let the curse define us? Or will we step out of the rubble and rebuild not as ghosts, but as ourselves? That is the choice David never made. But it is the choice still open to us. So the next time you watch The Lost Boys, don't just see David as the leather-clad king of Santa Carla. See the boy in the rubble. See the curse that tethered him. And see the lesson he leaves behind. Evil doesn't always wear fangs. Sometimes it looks like a smile, a promise of belonging, a family that feels too good to lose. Sometimes, evil is simply the past we never escape.